This is a reading of the 40th anniversary Inlay Booklet of the CD DVD audio of King Crimson's Court in the Court of the Crimson King. It was a time and a place and something else as well. Chapter 1. The single most important notion to convey is the sense and presence of otherness that visited King Crimson during the first half of 1969. Completely outside the operations of musicians, the business, the record, the performances, and everything that gave rise to the tangible entity King Crimson. There was something completely other surrounding this group. I don't believe we went from failure to international success in 9 months without help from somewhere. King Crimson and this album came from nowhere. After the event, we can find causes and effects. King Crimson was part of the remarkable creative explosion that emerged through popular culture, and especially rock music. Where did that come from? Like it or not, the group was special. King Crimson in 1969 had the right music, musicians, music industrials, and audience in attendance at the right time and place to make it work. Factors that contributed to King Crimson's rapid success include conceptual and exuberant musical skill, commitment, desperation, surprise, Barry Goldberg's album cover, the time of the world, technology, the Ford Transit van, a patron in Angus Hunking, management and record company, the unstoppable growth of the record industry between 1968 and 1978, the widespread social acceptance of drug use, but above all, it was the presence of the Good Fairy. The empowering impulse of underground rock, which became progressive rock, was the belief that we can change the world. Even the act of listening had power. The connection between the peace movement and the counterculture rock music was the voice of a generation. An instrument of political and personal expression was clear. Rock musicians enjoyed a privileged role. They were taken seriously as mouthpieces for the culture. A benevolent presence was at work through rock music and the large outdoor music festivals. A significant feature of the period, King Crimson broke to large publics at 2 of them, Hyde Park and West Palm Beach. Chapter 2. King Crimson was conceived in the kitchen of 93A Brondesbury Road during the second half of November 1968, and born on January 13, 1969, in the Fulham Palace Cafe. On December 7, 1969, while driving to Big Sur, Ian MacDonald told me of the decision taken by Michael Giles and himself to leave the band, made during the preceding 3 days in Los Angeles. The last performance by the first incarnation of King Crimson was at the Fillmore West, San Francisco on December 14, 1969. The shock of the group's performances, from its debut on April 9, 1969 at London Speakeasy, is difficult to convey 40 years afterwards. In the Court of the Crimson King, the only studio record from this incarnation, fails to convey the power of the band in live performance. Both were a considerable influence on the musicians and groups of its generation. My own perspective on Crimson is obviously rather different from the other founder members, although we would probably agree that this Crimson was charmed. There was something completely other which touched this group and which we called our Good Fairy. Reflecting on this for several years, I eventually concluded that sometimes music leans over and takes us into its confidence. This was one of those times. These were some of those people. Crimson in 1969 was a painful experience for me. I remember little joy in the experience other than the music, and the music was remarkable. The rest of the life provided a broad liberal education and opportunity and privilege that few young people get to embrace. What have I learned in the subsequent 40 years? 1. The inexpressible benevolence of the creative impulse. 2. The inexhaustible human capacity for lying, theft, corruption, cruelty, irresponsibility, exploitation, evasion, self-deception, and hypocrisy. And that's only the music industry. 3. The impossibility that what is lesser in us may support what is higher without a personal discipline. The 2009 remix. This, the Wilson Fripp 2009 Definitive Edition remix, was an unexpected yet inevitable outcome of Stevens' interest and initiative in moving the Crimson catalog into 5.1. The original Wessex recording was on 8-track. This necessitated several submixes such as drums, bass guitar, piano, and acoustic guitar on one stereo pair and all the mellotrons on another. These stereo submixes were then mixed down to the original stereo master. The final master took another generation to allow for crossfades, and production masters went another generation. The original stereo master was lost for decades, found by Alex Monday in a pile of King Crimson tapes from the Virgin Tape Store, and until recently was the best master available. On this release, Steven was able to transfer all the original analog multi-tracks to digital, enabling us to work from the first generation tracks prior to sub-mixing. We have taken the original mix as our template. The only significant change to the original release is our edit of the improv following Moonchild. This was discussed at the time, has been discussed since, and is now done. Robert Fripp, June 27, 2009, Worcestershire, England. The next section is written by Sid Smith, freelance music writer. Whichever way you look at it, this band was in a hurry. Officially starting on January 13, 1969, 10 days later, after pondering a variety of names, the bulk of the band settled on King Crimson. In February, island label A&R boss Muff Winwood visited the Fulham Palace Road rehearsal rooms. Initially unimpressed, the industry bigwig told Crimson manager David Ethoven the band reminded him of the Tremolos. Despite such comparisons, the band carried on their daily rehearsal regime for 3 months, including a week-long run in a Newcastle nightclub where they'd been booked as Giles, and Fripp, eventually making their formal live debut at the Speakeasy on April 9, 1969. In a matter of weeks, the buzz created by those early shows carried them into BBC's Maida Vale studios to record a session for John Peel's radio show. A few days later, Jimi Hendrix saw the group set at the Revolution Club and declared, "This is the best band in the world." Just over a month after the Crimson were in Morgan Studios, starting to record their debut album. From April to June, they'd gone from obscurity of a basement in the Fulham Palace Road to working on an album with renowned Moody Blues producer Tony Clark. In between recording dates, the band continued to work live. The galloping pace of their development hadn't let up for an instant when they set off on the morning of July 5th to meet up at Hyde Park to play on a bill supporting the Rolling Stones. If anyone thought things were moving fast before this concert, after it, everything suddenly went into hyperspeed. Immediately after Hyde Park, Crimson and Clark relocated to Wessex Studios to have another attempt at recording the album. However, things didn't work out. In the middle of July, these 5 young men with only a few gigs and a single BBC radio session under their belt told one of the most successful record producers of the day that they'd rather go it alone. On Monday, 21st July, King Crimson walked into Wessex Studios and took control of their own fate and began work on their elusive debut album for the 3rd time. 3 consecutive days were spent on the title track, I Talk to the Wind, a song which Giles, Fripp, and MacDonald had been playing since 1968, was tried and tested in all kinds of moods and voicings. The chilling prophecy, promise of epitaph was only finally nailed after an epic 10 hours recording session. Tired from the rigors of the schedule, the very next day they embarked upon the bittersweet beauty of Moonchild, deciding that neither Drop In or their cover of Donovan's Get Thy Bearings, both part of their live set at the time, fitted the mood they'd created so far. Not for the last time in Crimson's career, they improvised their way out of a corner. With Greg Lake looking on in the control booth, Giles, Fripp, and McDonald, the latter trying out a set of vibes found in a corner of the studio, sat down and in one take literally pulled the music out of thin air. The day after the gentle chimes of Moonchild's dreamy suite, the backing track for 21st Century Schizoid Man was laid down in one devastating live take. With the bones of the album complete, the band took to the road once again, returning when contractual obligations allowed to bounce tapes down in order to apply overdubs and for Greg Lake to begin laying down some of the most distinctive vocals of his career. In mid-August, they returned to the BBC's Maud Vale studios for another John Peel session, and on August 20th began final work on Schizoid Man. Working through the night, it wasn't until around 8:30 the following morning on the 21st August, after Fripp delivered a live solo in one take, that work on their first album was completed. Pete Seinfeld's connection to the wider art scene yielded one of the most impressive album covers in rock music history. Painted by his friend Barry Godber, the art student was a fan of the band since the beginning, attending rehearsals, designing a poster for the group, as well as the Flaming Eyes attachment to Michael Giles' double bass drum shells. Rarely had an album sleeve so accurately echoed the shock and awe reaction which this extraordinary music produced in its listeners. Even the advent of the CD and the jewel case has done little to dilute its iconic power. At Fripp's suggestion, the album was subtitled An Observation by King Crimson, and in early September the record was mastered at CBS facilities before being released on October. Pete Townsend waxed lyrical in a half-page advert, the key message leaping out that the album is an uncanny masterpiece. From nowhere, it went straight to the top 5 of the UK album charts. When the record was released, they'd been together less than 9 months. In the Court of the Crimson King was a decisive break with the blues rock motifs that still dominated the underground scene output. There were no lengthy solos anywhere on the album. Instead, Crimson's collective attention was directed at beautifully crafted and detailed arrangements, symphonic allusions, and a daring ambition in a group so young. There was interest in signing the band from several major American labels, but none were as keen as Atlantic. David Etenhoven and John Gayden went over to the States and played the album to Atlantic boss Amit Ertegun, I never get that right, who listened to the record from start to finish without interruption and then promptly signed the group to his label. In late October, the band flew to America, where Ian MacDonald spent his first day mastering the LP at Atlantic Records facilities in New York, and from there on to a series of concerts that propelled their debut record into the top 30 album charts. In the midst of a kaleidoscope American travelogue that saw the group cross the vast coast-to-coast distance, Michael Giles and Ian MacDonald, homesick and beginning to find the hurly-burly pace more than they could handle, decided to quit at the end of the tour. When they left the stage of San Francisco, Fillmore West, on Sunday 14th December, it was over. The whirlwind adventure that was King Crimson in 1969, with one LP and over 70 gigs under their belt, had lasted a mere 335 days from start to finish. A meteoric career in every sense of the word. 40 years later, and Steve Wilson found himself working on a new stereo and 5.1 mixes of an album he revered as a teenager. Quote, "The whole remixing process has been a window into something slightly surreal for me, that's for sure. One of the funniest things was when I got the master tapes for Court, and listening through to Schizoid Man, and you realize that this was basically cut live. This historic burning piece is basically the birth of progressive rock right there in front of you, and you get to the end of the take and you hear Michael Giles say, "How'd you feel about that?" The irony of hearing that at the end of what you know to be a piece of history just made me laugh. Of course, at the time, they were just guys in the studio cutting a take, but now as part of history, and the idea that it could have possibly been better seems ridiculous in a way. Unquote. As with other albums in the Crimson catalog, Wilson worked closely with Robert Fripp. Quote, "We spent about 3 days just doing a new stereo mix and were able to go back in some cases 2 generations of tape because, of course, what they were doing in those days was always doing submixes and bouncing down. By going back to the slave reels and syncing them with the original tracking reels, so we were going back to the very first generation. So number one, that gave Robert more flexibility with what he wanted to hear in the final mix, and number two, we actually got better quality because we weren't using any second or third generation bounce downs. That makes it closer than even the original band were at the time of the recording. When they were mixing it, they weren't able to go into the mix in that kind of detail. They weren't able to say, I'd like to pull that one guitar phrase and pull it out of the mix. They were very much committed to what they had already bounced down. We were able to go into the music in a way that no one's been into it before. Sid Smith, July 2009. This has been a reading of the Inlay book for the 40th anniversary CD, DVD-A, Steve Wilson mix of King Crimson's 1969 debut, In the Court of the Crimson King. Thanks for listening.